Victor Harrow, a racist cop, arrests black FBI agent's daughter Chloe over a suspicious theft accusation. But just 3 minutes later, Chloe's father, Samuel, strikes back, turning the officer's world upside down with a brutal revenge. What hidden dangers lie beneath the surface? And how far will a father go to protect his child before we get into the story? Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to The Sun. Shone brightly on the busy city streets as Chloe Bennett made her way through the crowd. Her heart was light, and a big smile played on her lips. Today was special. She was on a mission to find the perfect birthday gift for her mom. Chloe's eyes sparkled with excitement as she spotted the fancy jewelry store up ahead. The glittering window display made her pause for a moment. She took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy glass door. A little bell jingled as she stepped inside. The store was quiet and cool, a stark contrast to the noisy street outside. Chloe's eyes widened as she took in all the sparkling treasures around her. "Can I help you, miss?" a kind voice asked. Chloe turned to see a smiling lady behind the counter. "Oh yes, please," she said. "I'm looking for a birthday gift for my mom." The lady's smile grew warmer. "That's so thoughtful of you. Do you have something in mind?" "Thanks," she said softly. "My dad always says it's important to show people how much we care." The lady nodded. "Your dad sounds like a wise man." "He is," Chloe agreed, her chest swelling with pride. As Chloe continued to browse, she thought about all the times her dad had encouraged her to be kind and thoughtful, like the time she wanted to skip her friend's birthday party because she was too tired. Samuel had gently reminded her how she'd feel if her friends didn't come to her party, or when she was nervous about giving a speech in class, and he helped her practice for hours. He always said, "Chloe, the most important thing is to speak from your heart." Now, standing in this fancy store, Chloe felt grateful for all those lessons. She wasn't just buying a necklace. She was showing her mom how much she cared, just like her dad had taught her. Chloe's eyes danced from one sparkling display to another, her heart fluttering with excitement. Each necklace seemed more beautiful than the last, and she found herself lost in a world of glittering gems and shining metals as she moved closer to a display of delicate pendants. Chloe felt a sudden chill run down her spine. She glanced up only to find a well-dressed woman staring at her with an intensity that made her stomach twist. The woman, who Chloe would later learn was Mrs. Annabelle, wore an expensive-looking suit and a frown that seemed etched into her face. Her eyes never left Chloe as she leaned over to whisper something to a nearby store employee. Chloe's cheeks grew warm as she noticed the employee's suspicious glance in her direction. She tried to focus on the necklaces in front of her, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached out to touch a pretty silver chain. "Is everything okay?" Chloe wanted to ask, but the words stuck in her throat. She'd never felt so out of place before. The joy she'd felt earlier began to fade, replaced by annoying anxiety that made her want to run from the store. But Chloe thought of her mom and the perfect gift she was determined to find. She took a deep breath just like her dad had taught her when she felt nervous. "I belong here just as much as anyone else," she reminded herself silently. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of Miss S. Annabelle's eyes boring into her back. Every time Chloe moved to a different display, she could hear whispers and feel stares following her. The beautiful jewelry store now felt more like a cave. With Chloe trapped inside. She tried to focus on choosing a necklace, but her mind kept wandering back to Mrs. Horror and the employee. Why were they watching her so closely? Had she done something wrong without realizing it? Chloe's hands shook as she picked up a delicate blue pendant. It was beautiful, exactly the kind of thing her mom would love. But as she held it, she noticed Miss S. Annabelle nudged the employee and nodded in her direction. The uneasy feeling in Chloe's stomach grew stronger. She wanted nothing more than to leave the store to escape the judging eyes and whispered words. But she also wanted to prove to herself and to them that she had every right to be there with a mix of determination and fear. Chloe continued to browse, all too aware of the tension building around her. She tried to ignore the LS, focusing instead on finding the perfect gift for her mom. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong as Chloe stepped out of the jewelry store. Her heart heavy with disappointment, she took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. She hadn't found the perfect gift for her mom, but she was relieved to be free from the uncomfortable atmosphere inside. Her moment of relief was short-lived. A stern voice called out, "Excuse me, miss, stop right there." Chloe turned to see a police officer striding toward her, his face set in a hard frown. Her stomach dropped as he approached, his badge glinting in the sunlight. "I'm Officer Victor Harrow," he said, his voice gruff and authoritative. "We've had a report of a missing necklace from the display case. I need you to empty your pockets." Chloe's eyes widened in shock. "What? But I didn't take anything." Her voice trembled as she spoke, her hands shaking at her sides. "Officer." Victor's eyes narrowed. "That's what they all say. Now empty your pockets, or I'll have to search you myself." Tears welled up in Chloe's eyes as she fumbled with her jacket pockets. "Please, there's been a mistake. I was just looking. I swear I didn't take anything." As Chloe turned out her empty pockets, a small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk. Whispers and pointed fingers made Chloe's cheeks burn with embarrassment. She looked guilty. One onlooker muttered, "Poor girl, she seemed so scared." Another whispered, "Officer." Victor's voice grew louder and more aggressive. "Where did you hide it? In your bag? Your shoes?" Chloe's voice cracked as she pleaded, "I didn't take anything, please. You have to believe me." The crowd grew larger, their whispers becoming a dull roaring in Chloe's ears. She felt trapped, surrounded by accusing eyes and judgmental stares. Her hands trembled as she clutched her bag close to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "I want to call my dad," Chloe said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Officer," Victor scoffed, "you can call your dad from the station now. Hand over your bag." Chloe's world seemed to spin around her. She couldn't believe this was happening. Just minutes ago, she had been excited about finding a gift for her mom. Now she was being accused of theft in front of a growing crowd of strangers as Officer Victor reached for her bag. Chloe took a step back, her eyes darting around frantically, searching for a friendly face in the sea of onlookers. But all she saw were curious stares and disapproving frowns. As the tension escalated, a commanding voice cut through the crowd. "What's going on here?" The sea of onlookers parted, revealing a tall, imposing man with a determined stride. It was Samuel Bennett, Chloe's father, his face etched with concern and anger, and Chloe's eyes lit up with relief. "Dad!" she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. Samuel quickly made his way to his daughter's side, placing a protective arm around her trembling shoulders. He turned to face Officer Victor, his eyes blazing with intensity. "I'm Samuel Bennett, FBI," he said, his voice calm but authoritative as he flashed his badge. "What's the meaning of this, officer?" Victor's demeanor shifted slightly, but he stood his ground. "This young woman is suspected of shoplifting a valuable necklace from the jewelry store," he stated firmly. Samuel's eyebrows furrowed. "And what evidence do you have to support this accusation?" Victor hesitated for a moment. "We received a report. A report is not evidence." Samuel interrupted, his voice sharp. "Have you checked the security cameras? Search my daughter. Find any stolen property." The crowd watched in hushed silence as the confrontation unfolded. Chloe clung to her father's side, drawing strength from his presence. Victor's face reddened. "I was in the process of conducting a search when you arrived," he said defensively. Samuel's eyes narrowed without probable cause or a warrant. "I don't think so." He turned to Chloe, his voice softening. "Sweetheart, did you take anything from the store?" Billy shook her head vigorously. "No, Dad. I swear I didn't." Samuel nodded and then faced Victor again. "My daughter says she's innocent, and you have no evidence to the contrary. I demand that you release her immediately." The tension in the air was palpable as Victor and Samuel stared each other down suddenly. Victor's radio crackled to life. Officer Harrow's stern voice came through, "Report back to the precinct immediately." Victor's face fell, realizing the situation had escalated. Beyond his control, he cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "This isn't over," he muttered before turning on his heel and striding away. As Victor retreated, the crowd began to disperse, their whispers fading. In the background, Samuel hugged Chloe tightly, feeling her body shake with silent sobs. "It's okay, sweetheart," he murmured, stroking her hair. "You're safe now. Let's go home." As the tension began to dissipate, Victor's face softened unexpectedly. He took a deep breath and turned to face Chloe and Samuel. "I owe you both an apology," Victor said, his voice low and hesitant. "I may have overreacted in this situation." Chloe and Samuel exchanged surprised glances. The crowd that remained watched in stunned silence. Victor continued, his eyes meeting Chloe's. "Miss Bennett, I'm sorry for putting you through this ordeal. It was unprofessional of me to make accusations without proper evidence. He then turned to Samuel, Agent Bennett. I apologize for my conduct. I should have handled this situation more carefully. Samuel studied Victor's face, trying to gauge the sincerity of his words while the apology seemed genuine. A nagging doubt lingered in his mind. He nodded curtly, acknowledging Victor's words but not quite ready to forgive. Thank you for the apology, Officer Harrow, Samuel said in his measured tone. I hope this serves as a learning experience. As Victor walked away, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his actions. Chloe tugged gently on her father's sleeve. Dad, she whispered, her voice still shaky. There's something else you should know. Samuel looked down at his daughter, concern etched on his face. What is it, sweetheart? Chloe took a deep breath. Inside the store, there was this woman. Miss S. Annabelle kept watching me, like she was suspicious of something. It made me really uncomfortable. Samuel's brow furrowed as he processed this new information. Miss S. Annabelle, did you know her? Chloe shook her head. No, I've never seen her before, but she was whispering to one of the employees and pointing at me. A troubled look crossed Samuel's face. He gently squeezed Chloe's shoulder. That's important information. Chloe, thank you for telling me. As they stood there, the bustle of the city continuing around them. Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this incident than met the eye. The pieces didn't quite fit together: Victor's aggressive behavior, his sudden apology, and now this mysterious Mrs. Annabelle. Something wasn't right, and Samuel was determined to get to the bottom of it. Samuel gently guided Chloe to his car, his protective arm around her shoulders. As they drove home, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his stomach. Something about this whole situation just didn't add up. You okay, sweetheart? He asked, glancing at Chloe. She nodded, but her eyes were distant. I just can't believe that happened. It was so scary, Dad. Samuel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. I know, honey. I'm sorry you had to go through that, but we'll figure this out. I promise. As they pulled into their driveway, Samuel's mind was racing. He kept replaying the scene in his head, focusing on the brief exchange he'd witnessed between Miss S. Annabelle and the store employee just before Chloe was confronted once inside. Samuel made sure Chloe was comfortable and had everything she needed. Why don't you rest for a bit? I need to make a few calls. Chloe nodded, curling up on the couch with a blanket. Samuel kissed her forehead before heading to his home office. He sat at his desk, determination etched on his face. This wasn't just about clearing Chloe's name anymore. His instincts told him there was something deeper going on, and he was going to get to the bottom of it. Samuel picked up his phone and dialed the jewelry store's number. After a brief conversation with the receptionist, he was connected to the manager. Hello, this is FBI agent Samuel Bennett, he said, his voice calm but authoritative. I'd like to discuss the incident that occurred at your store earlier today, involving my daughter. The manager sounded nervous. Oh yes, that was unfortunate. How can I help you, Agent Bennett? I'd like to come in and review any security footage you have from today. Samuel replied, I believe there may be more to this situation than what appeared on the surface. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Of course, Agent Bennett. When would you like to come in? I'll be there in an hour, Samuel said firmly after hanging up. Samuel checked on Chloe once more before grabbing his keys. He had a determined look in his eyes as he headed out the door. Whatever was going on, he was going to uncover the truth and make sure justice was served. Samuel arrived at the jewelry store, his determined stride carrying him through the glass doors. The manager, a balding man in his 50s, greeted him with a nervous smile. Agent Bennett. Thank you for coming, the manager said, wringing his hands. I'm Mr. Spencer. How can I assist you today? Samuel's keen eyes scanned the store, taking in every detail. I'd like to review the security footage from the day. My daughter was here. Mr. Spencer's smile faltered. Yes, about that. We've been having some technical issues with our security system. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Is that so? What kind of issue? Well, you see, Mr. Spencer stammered. There seems to be a gap in the footage during the time your daughter was in the store. Samuel's suspicion grew, a knot forming in his stomach. That's quite a coincidence, don't you think? Mr. Spencer nodded nervously. Yes, it is unfortunate timing. We've called our tech support, but they haven't been able to recover the missing footage yet. Samuel crossed his arms, his gaze steady. I'd still like to see what you do have. Perhaps we can piece together what happened. I'm not sure that would be helpful, Mr. Spencer said, his eyes darting around the store without the crucial footage. It might just cause more confusion. Samuel leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. Mr. Spencer, I'm here as part of an official investigation. I'd appreciate your full cooperation in this matter. The manager swallowed hard. Of course, Agent Bennett, it's just our policy. We need to protect our customers' privacy. Samuel's patience was wearing thin. I understand privacy concerns, but this is about clearing my daughter's name. Surely you can see how important this is. Mr. Spencer nodded reluctantly. I'll see what I can do, but I can't promise anything, as the manager fumbled with excuses. Samuel made mental notes that something wasn't right here, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. He'd need to look into the store's history and check for any previous incidents or complaints. Thank you for your time, Mr. Spencer. Samuel said. His tone was measured. I'll be in touch, and I expect full cooperation moving forward. As Samuel left the store, his mind was already racing with next steps. This was far from over, and he wouldn't rest until he uncovered the truth. May left the jewelry store. His mind was whirling with questions. Something wasn't right, and he could feel it in his bones as he drove back to his office. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye back at his desk. Samuel dove into research. He pulled up records of recent incidents at the jewelry store, his eyes scanning the reports with growing concern. A pattern began to emerge, and it made his heart sink. Over the past 6 months, there had been 5 separate incidents involving black teenagers being accused of theft at the same store. In each case, the teens had been detained and questioned only to be released later when no evidence was found. Samuel leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. This couldn't be a coincidence. As he dug deeper, another detail caught his eye. In 4 out of the 5 cases, Mrs. Annabelle had been present or involved in reporting the supposed suspicious behavior. This can't be happening, Samuel muttered to himself, his voice heavy with disbelief and anger. He pulled up Miss S. Samuel set the photo down and stood up, determination etched on his face. He knew the road ahead would be challenging. Taking on someone like Mrs. Annabelle with her connections and influence wouldn't be easy, but he had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when it came to protecting the innocent. Time to get to work, he said to himself, grabbing his jacket. He had leads to follow, witnesses to interview, and a truth to uncover. Samuel Bennett was on a mission, and he wouldn't rest until he got to the bottom of this troubling pattern of injustice. Samuel delved deeper into Mrs. Annabelle's background, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he searched through databases and public records. His eyes widened as he uncovered a crucial piece of information. Mrs. Annabelle was the wife of Judge Samuel Annabelle, a local judge with a controversial history. Well, Samuel muttered, leaning back in his chair. What do we have here? He pulled up Judge Annabelle's case history, focusing on rulings involving racial discrimination as he scrolled through the records. A troubling pattern emerged in case after case. Judge Annabelle had ruled against plaintiffs claiming racial discrimination, often dismissing their complaints on technicalities. Samuel's jaw clenched. This wasn't just about Mrs. Annabelle anymore. It was becoming clear that her actions might be part of a larger systemic issue. Determined to gather more evidence, Samuel set out to interview witnesses from previous incidents at the jewelry store. He started with CLA, a college student who had been working at the coffee shop across the street. I remember seeing that woman there a lot. CLA said, her brow furrowed. She always seemed to be watching the younger customers, especially if they were black. It made me uncomfortable. Samuel nodded, jotting down notes. Did you ever see her interact with the store staff? Claire's eyes lit up with recognition. Actually, yes, she was always whispering to them, pointing out customers. It seemed off as Samuel interviewed more witnesses. A clear pattern began to emerge. Mrs. Annabelle had been present during multiple incidents, always singling out young black customers as suspicious. One witness, an elderly man named Mr. Johnson, shook his head sadly as he recounted what he'd seen. It's a shame, really. Those kids were just trying to shop, same as anyone else. Mr. Johnson said, but that woman, she'd watch them like a hawk, then go running to the staff. Next thing, the securities involved Samuel's notebook, filled up with similar accounts. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, painting a disturbing picture of racial profiling and discrimination back at his office. Samuel spread out his notes, connecting the dots between Mrs. Annabelle's complaints and the subsequent incidents. He created a timeline marking each event and noting the similarities. "This can't be a coincidence," he said to himself, staring at the evidence before him. The pattern was clear. Miss S. Annabelle had consistently targeted young black customers, filing complaints that led to their detainment and questioning. Samuel sat back, running a hand through his hair. He knew he was onto something big, something that went beyond just one incident with his daughter. This was about a systemic issue of racial profiling, one that had been going on for far too long. Samuel's investigation took an unexpected turn when he stumbled upon a crucial piece of information. As he delved deeper into Victor Harlow's background, he discovered a surprising connection that made his heart race. "Well, I'll be damned," Samuel muttered, staring at his computer screen. It turned out that Victor's brother James Harrow was a high-profile defense attorney. What caught Samuel's attention wasn't just James's impressive client list, but one particular name that stood out: Annabelle. Samuel leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the document. James Harrow had represented Miss S. Annabelle and her husband, Judge Samuel Annabelle, in various legal matters over the years. The connection was undeniable. "This can't be a coincidence," Samuel said to himself, his mind racing with possibilities. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. The pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a picture that was far more complex than he had initially imagined. It wasn't just about racial bias anymore. There was something deeper, more sinister at play. Samuel picked up his phone and dialed partner agent. "Elena Morales, I need you to dig into Victor Harrow's financials," he said as soon as she answered. "Look for any unusual transactions or connections to the Annabelle family on it." Elena replied, "What are you thinking?" Samuel sighed heavily. "I'm thinking this whole incident with Chloe might be part of a larger scheme. Victor's brother has represented the Annabelle family. It's possible Victor was influenced to target Chloe specifically. That's a serious accusation." Elena warned, "We need solid evidence." I know Samuel agreed. That's why we need to be thorough. This could go beyond just one incident of racial profiling. We might be looking at a pattern of corruption involving the police, the courts, and who knows what else. As Samuel hung up the phone, he felt a mix of determination and unease. The case had taken a turn he hadn't expected, and the implications were far-reaching. If his suspicions were correct, it meant that the incident wasn't just a random act of bias, but a calculated move in a much larger game. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began mapping out the connections. Miss S. Annabelle, Judge Annabelle, Victor Harrow, and James Harrow are all linked in a web of potential corruption, and at the center of it all is his daughter Chloe, unwittingly caught in their crosshairs. Samuel's jaw clenched as he stared at the diagram. He knew he was stepping into dangerous territory. These were powerful people with a lot to lose if their schemes were exposed, but he couldn't back down now, not when his daughter's safety and the integrity of the justice system were at stake. Samuel sat at his desk, poring over the latest report he'd received. His eyes widened as he read the details, and he let out a low whistle. The missing necklace, the very one Chloe had been accused of stealing, had actually been reported stolen weeks before the incident. "This doesn't add up," Samuel muttered, shaking his head. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, determined to get answers. The drive to the jewelry store felt longer than usual, his mind racing with questions and theories as Samuel pushed open the store's glass door. The soft chime of bells announced his arrival. The manager, Mr. Spencer, looked up from behind the counter, his smile faltering as he recognized Samuel Agent Bennett. Mr. Spencer said, his voice tight, "What can I do for you today?" Samuel approached the counter, his eyes locked on the manager. "I need to talk to you about the missing necklace, Mr. The one my daughter was accused of stealing, Mr. Spencer's smile disappeared completely. "I thought we had cleared that up, Agent Bennett." "It was a misunderstanding." Samuel pulled out a copy of the report. "According to this, that necklace was reported stolen 3 weeks before the incident with my daughter. Care to explain?" The color drained from Mr. Spencer's face. He fumbled with his glasses, avoiding Samuel's gaze. "There must be some mistake," he stammered. "I don't think so," Samuel pressed. "This report is quite clear. So why was my daughter accused of stealing a necklace that had already been reported missing?" Mr. Spencer took a deep breath, seeming to gather himself. "It was a simple error, Agent Bennett. The necklace was thought to have been returned. We must have forgotten to update the report." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Forgotten? That's a pretty big thing to forget, Mr. Spencer, especially when it led to an innocent teenager being accused of theft. The manager's explanation felt hollow and raised more questions than it answered. Samuel could feel his suspicion growing with each passing moment. There was more to this story, and he was determined to uncover it. "I'd like to see your inventory records," Samuel said. His tone left no room for argument, and any security footage from the day that necklace was supposedly returned. Mr. Spencer's eyes darted nervously around the store. "I'm not sure I can provide that without consulting our legal team," he stammered. Samuel leaned in closer, his voice low but firm. "Mr. Spencer, I hope you understand the seriousness of this situation. If there's something you're not telling me, now would be the time to come clean." The manager's silence spoke volumes. Samuel could almost see the gears turning in the man's head, weighing his options. Whatever was going on here, it was clear that the jewelry store was involved in something far more complex than a simple misunderstanding. Samuel left the jewelry store, his mind buzzing with unanswered questions. He knew he needed more information, and his next lead was closer to home. With a deep breath, he dialed a number. He really used the officer. "Grant, it's Agent Bennett. I need to talk to you about Victor." "Harrow." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Samuel, you know I can't discuss internal matters," Officer Grant replied, his voice hesitant. "I'm not asking for anything official," Samuel assured him. "Just a conversation between old friends. Can we meet an hour later?" Samuel sat across from the officer. Grant, in a quiet corner of a local diner, looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around as if expecting to be overheard. "What's this about, Samuel?" Grant asked in a low voice, and Samuel leaned forward. "I need to understand Victor's behavior and his connection to Miss S. Annabelle. There's something not right about the incident with my daughter Grant," running a hand through his thinning hair. "Look, Victor is complicated. He and his brother are close, really close." Samuel's eyebrows raised. His brother, the defense attorney, Grant, nodded. "Yeah, well, they look out for each other. If one's in a tight spot, the other's always there to help out." "Help out how?" Samuel pressed Grant, shifting in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "I shouldn't say more, but let's just say if Victor ever finds himself in hot water, his brother's always there to cool things down, and vice versa." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. This was more than he'd expected. And Miss S. Annabelle, how does she fit into all this? Grant's eyes widened slightly. "Miss S. Annabelle, I don't know anything about that," but Samuel could see the flicker of recognition in the officer's eyes. There was a connection there, something Grant wasn't saying. "Thank you for your time, officer," Samuel said, standing up. "You've been very helpful." As he walked out of the diner, Samuel's mind was racing. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Victor and his brother covering for each other. Miss S. Annabelle with her connections to the local judge. And now a falsely reported stolen necklace. There was more to this than just racial bias. Samuel was now certain that Victor had been influenced, maybe even coerced, into targeting Chloe. But why? What was the bigger picture he was missing? Samuel got into his car, his determination stronger than ever. He would uncover the truth no matter where it led him, for Chloe and for justice. Samuel sat at his desk poring over the files he had gathered. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was more complex than he had initially thought. He rubbed his tired eyes, trying to make sense of the information in front of him. As he flipped through the pages, a pattern began to emerge. Samuel's eyes widened as he realized the implications. Miss S. Annabelle's name appeared repeatedly in connection with jewelry insurance claims. Each claim coincided with reports of stolen jewelry from the same store where Chloe had been accused. "This can't be a coincidence," Samuel muttered to himself, his heart racing. He picked up his phone and dialed a trusted contact at the insurance company. After a brief conversation, his suspicions were confirmed. Miss S. Annabelle had filed multiple claims over the past year, each for substantial amounts. Samuel leaned back in his chair, the weight of this new information settling on his shoulders. It wasn't just about racial profiling anymore. This was a carefully orchestrated fraud scheme, and Chloe had unwittingly become a pawn in Mrs. Annabelle's game. She needed a scapegoat. Samuel said aloud, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. And Chloe was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He thought about his daughter, how shaken she had been after the incident. The injustice of it all made his blood boil. Miss S. Annabelle had just wronged Chloe, She had manipulated the system using racial bias as a smokescreen for her criminal activities. Samuel stood up, determination filling him. He needed to act fast. This new information changed everything. It wasn't just about clearing Chloe's name anymore. It was about exposing a larger conspiracy that had likely affected many innocent people. He picked up his phone again, this time calling his supervisor. "Sir, one need to brief you on a development in the case involving my daughter. It's bigger than we thought." As Samuel explained the situation, he could hear the surprise in his supervisor's voice. "This is serious, Bennett. We'll need to involve the fraud division. How solid is your evidence?" "Solid enough to warrant a full investigation," Samuel replied confidently, "but we need to move quickly. If Mrs. Annabelle realizes we're onto her, she might try to cover her tracks after hanging up." Samuel took a deep breath. The case had taken an unexpected turn, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for Chloe. Now, he was fighting for justice on a much larger scale. As Samuel delved deeper into the case, the situation took an unexpected turn. Victor's brother, a prominent defense attorney named James Harrow, held a press conference to publicly defend Miss S. Annabelle, standing before a sea of cameras and microphones. As Samuel sat at his kitchen table scrolling through the news on his tablet, he felt nausea in his stomach. The pressure was mounting, and he could feel the weight of public scrutiny bearing down on him. He looked up to see Chloe enter the room, her eyes red and puffy from lack of sleep. "Dad," Chloe said softly, her voice trembling, "people at school are talking about us. They're saying awful things." Samuel's heart ached for his daughter. He stood up and wrapped her in a hug. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. This isn't fair to you." Chloe buried her face in her father's chest. "Why won't they leave us alone? I just want things to go back to normal." As Samuel held his daughter, he felt a mix of anger and determination. He knew he was on the right track with the investigation, but the constant media attention was taking its toll on both of them. Later that day, Samuel received a call from his supervisor, Bennett. "We need to talk about the media coverage. It's not looking good." Samuel sighed heavily. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just working on clearing our names." Chloe stepped into the room, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I want to help. This isn't just about me anymore, is it? It's about all the people Miss S. Annabelle has hurt." Samuel felt a surge of pride for his daughter's strength. Despite the pressure and attention, she was thinking of others. He nodded, realizing that they were in this fight together. The next morning, as Samuel sat at his desk sifting through mountains of paperwork, his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Hesitantly, he answered. "Agent Bennett," a nervous voice whispered. "I have some information about what happened at the jewelry store." Samuel's heart raced. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "I can't say my name," the caller replied. "I work at the store. I saw something that day, something important." Samuel grabbed a pen and paper. "I'm listening. Please tell me everything you saw." The employee's words tumbled out in a rush. "Mrs. Annabelle was there that day. I saw her whispering to the store manager just before your daughter was detained. It looked suspicious." Samuel's pen flew across the paper, jotting down every detail. "What else?" he prompted. "There's more," the caller continued. "I saw Mrs. Annabelle handling a piece of jewelry. It was the same necklace that went missing. She was acting strange, looking around nervously, and then she just left in a hurry." Samuel said, "Can you discreetly pull the security camera footage from the streets around that jewelry store? I need to track Mrs. Annabelle's movements." That day, as he hung up, Samuel felt a glimmer of hope. He was one step closer to uncovering the truth and clearing Chloe's name, but he knew the road ahead would be challenging. He needed to tread carefully, gathering evidence without tipping off Mrs. Annabelle or her influential husband. Samuel stood up, determination etched on his face. He had a lead now, a thread to pull that could unravel this whole conspiracy. As he prepared to dive deeper into the investigation, he silently vowed to see this through no matter the cost. Samuel sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of documents and notes. The soft glow of his laptop screen illuminated his weary face as he pored over the latest developments in Chloe's case. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with a message from a trusted contact at the courthouse. His heart sank as he read the message. Victor's brother, a well-connected defense attorney, had somehow managed to fabricate records of Chloe's school history. These false documents painted a picture of Chloe as a troublemaker with a history of disciplinary issues and suspicious behavior. Samuel's hands trembled as he set down his phone. He couldn't believe the lengths these people were willing to go to discredit his daughter. The fabricated records were a direct attack on Chloe's character, designed to undermine Samuel's case and cast doubt on her innocence. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of despair settling on his shoulders. How could he fight against such powerful adversaries? They seemed to have connections everywhere, able to manipulate records and twist the truth to suit their needs. Samuel stood up and walked to Chloe's room, gently pushing open the door. She was asleep, her face peaceful and unaware of the storm brewing around her. His heart ached as he watched her, wondering how he could protect her from the lies and deceit that threatened to engulf them. Returning to the kitchen, Samuel slumped into his chair for the first time since this ordeal began. He felt truly overwhelmed. The fabricated school records were a devastating blow, one that could potentially sway public opinion and even influence the course of the investigation. He rubbed his temples, trying to push away the creeping doubts. Could he really stand up against these people? They had money, influence, and seemingly no moral boundaries. Samuel had always believed in the power of truth and justice, but now he found himself questioning if it would be enough as he sat there surrounded by the evidence of his tireless work. Samuel felt a flicker of uncertainty. He had promised Chloe that he would make things right, that he would clear her name, but now, faced with this new setback, he wasn't sure if he could keep that promise. The thought of failing Chloe, of letting these powerful forces win, made Samuel's stomach churn. He had always been her protector, her rock, but in this moment, he felt helpless against the tide of lies and corruption that threatened to sweep them away. The next day, as Samuel sat at his kitchen table, drowning in doubt and despair, his phone suddenly lit up with an incoming call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice weary and cautious. "Agent Bennett." A nervous voice whispered on the other end. "I work at the jewelry store. I can't take it anymore. I have something you need to see." Samuel's heart raced as he listened intently. The caller, a young employee named Nora, explained that she had been burdened with guilt ever since Chloe's incident. She couldn't stand by and watch an innocent girl's life be ruined. "I have proof," Nora said, her voice trembling. "Text messages between Mrs. Annabelle and our manager. They planned the whole thing." Samuel's hand shook as he grabbed a pen and paper, scribbling down Nora's instructions on where to meet. As he hung up, a glimmer of hope sparked in his chest. An hour later, Samuel sat in his car in a dimly lit parking lot, waiting anxiously. Nora appeared, looking around nervously before slipping into the passenger seat. She pulled out her phone and handed it to Samuel. "Here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I took screenshots. They thought they deleted everything, but I managed to recover these." Samuel scrolled through the messages, his eyes widening with each revelation. There it was in black and white. Miss S. Annabelle and the store manager are discussing their plan to use Chloe as a scapegoat for the missing necklace. One message from Miss S. Annabelle read, "Remember, the necklace was reported stolen weeks ago. We just need a believable suspect to close the case." The store manager had replied, "I've got the perfect mark. A young black girl who comes in often. We'll make it look like she took it." Samuel's heart pounded as he read message after message, each one confirming his suspicions and revealing the depths of the conspiracy against Chloe. The evidence was damning, showing not only racial profiling, but a deliberate attempt to frame an innocent teenager. "This is exactly what we needed," Samuel said, his voice filled with renewed determination. "Nora, you've done the right thing. This evidence will help clear Chloe's name and expose Mrs. Annabelle and her accomplices." Nora nodded, relief washing over her face. "I couldn't let them get away with it. It wasn't right what they did to that girl." As Samuel thanked Nora and assured her of his protection, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The tide was turning. With this concrete evidence in hand, he could finally prove Chloe's innocence and bring those responsible to justice. Armed with the damning evidence from Nora, Samuel wasted no time in presenting his findings to the authorities. He marched into the police station, determination etched on his face, and demanded to speak with the chief, Chief Reynolds. Samuel said, his voice steady as he laid out the evidence on the desk. "I have proof that Chloe's detainment was part of a larger conspiracy." Chief Reynolds' eyes widened as he scrolled through the text messages. "This is serious, Agent." Bennett was very serious indeed. Within hours, a team of detectives was assembled to reopen the case. They pored over the evidence, cross-referencing the text messages with security footage and witness statements. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing a disturbing pattern of racial profiling and fraud as the investigation unfolded. More sick VIMs came forward. Young black customers who had been wrongly accused of theft at the jewelry store shared their stories, each one adding weight to the case against Miss S, Annabelle, and the store manager, Detective Nina Garcia. The lead investigator shook her head in disbelief as she reviewed the mounting evidence. "It's clear now," she said to Samuel. "This wasn't just about your daughter. It was a systematic targeting of innocent people to cover up their insurance fraud." The authorities dug deeper into the jewelry store's practices, uncovering a trail of falsified reports and suspicious insurance claims. Miss S. Annabelle's involvement became increasingly apparent, her carefully crafted facade of respectability crumbling under scrutiny as the investigation progressed. Samuel felt a mix of relief and anger, relief that the truth was finally coming to light, and anger at the injustice that had been allowed to persist for so long. One afternoon, as Samuel sat in on a briefing with the investigative team, Chief Reynolds entered the room with a grim expression. "We have enough," he announced. "The district attorney has decided to file charges against Miss S. Annabelle and the store manager for fraud and conspiracy." A hush fell over the room as the weight of the announcement sank in. Samuel closed his eyes, letting out a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Justice was finally within reach as the investigation into the jewelry store conspiracy unfolded. Officer Victor Harrow found himself caught in the crosshairs of an internal affairs inquiry. The department launched a disciplinary action against him, scrutinizing his role in the wrongful detention of Victor. He sat nervously in a small, bare room at the police station, facing two stern-faced investigators. Officer Harrow, one of them, began, "We need to discuss your actions on the day of the incident involving Chloe Bennett." Victor's palms grew sweaty as he knotted his throat tight with anxiety. "I understand," he managed to say. The investigators delved into every aspect of that fateful day, questioning Victor's decision-making process and his relationship with Miss S. Annabelle as they pressed harder. Victor felt his carefully constructed explanations begin to crumble. "We're particularly interested in your connection to Miss S. Annabelle through your brother," the second investigator said. Leaning forward, "Did this relationship influence your actions that day?" Victor's heart raced as he struggled to find the right words. "I didn't think it did at the time, but now I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper as the investigation progressed. Victor's earlier apology to Chloe and Samuel came under intense scrutiny. Many of his colleagues began to question whether it had been a genuine moment of remorse or a calculated attempt to deflect blame. Maria Fernandez, who had witnessed the apology, shared her doubts with the investigators. "It seemed sincere at the time," she said, "but now, knowing what we know about his connection to Miss S. Annabelle, I can't help but wonder if it was just damage control." Victor found himself increasingly isolated at the precinct. Whispers followed him down the hallways, and conversations would abruptly stop when he entered a room. The weight of his actions and the possibility of losing his job pressed down on him like a physical burden. One evening, as Victor sat alone in the locker room, the full impact of his situation hit him. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Years of hard work and dedication to the force now hung in the balance, all because of one terrible mistake as the investigation into the jewelry store incident continued to unfold. Victor Harrow found himself at a crossroads. The weight of his actions and the potential consequences bore down on him, leaving him sleepless and anxious. After days of internal struggle, he made a decision that would change everything with trembling hands. Victor dialed Samuel Bennett's number. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited for an answer. When Samuel's deep voice came through the line, Victor almost lost his nerve against Bennett. Victor began, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is Officer Harrow. The first need to talk to you in person if possible." There was a long pause on the other end. Finally, Samuel agreed to meet Victor at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town the next day. Victor arrived early, nervously fidgeting with his cup of coffee. When Samuel walked in, Victor's stomach twisted with guilt and fear. The FBI agent's face was a mask of carefully controlled emotions as he sat down across from Victor. "Thank you for meeting me," Victor said, his eyes downcast. "I need to tell you something important." Samuel nodded, his gaze steady and expectant. Victor took a deep breath and began to speak. "I made a terrible mistake that day, with Chloe. I let my judgment be clouded by my own biases." His voice cracked with emotion but there's more to it than that. As Victor continued, he revealed the pressure he had felt from his brother to act on Mrs. Annabelle's tip. My brother, he's always been there for me. When he called and told me about Mrs. Annabelle's concerns, I felt like I had to do something, but I should have known better. I should have questioned it more. Tears welled up in Victor's eyes as he spoke. I'm not trying to make excuses. What I did was wrong, and I take full responsibility for my actions. But I want you to know that I truly am sorry, not just for what happened to Chloe, but for being part of a system that allows these injustices to happen. Samuel listened intently, his expression softening slightly as Victor poured out his heart. The officer's confession revealed a depth of internal conflict that Samuel hadn't expected. I understand if you can't forgive me, Victor said, wiping his eyes, but I needed you to know the truth. I'm ready to face whatever consequences come my way. I just hope that by coming forward, I can help make things right. Samuel sat in silence for a long moment, processing Victor's words. The anger that had been simmering inside him since the incident with Chloe began to soften, replaced by a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. He looked at Victor, seeing not just the officer who had wronged his daughter, but a man struggling with his own mistakes and biases. Taking a deep breath, Samuel spoke, his voice calm and measured. Victor, what you did that day hurt my daughter deeply. It shook her faith in the very people who are supposed to protect her. He paused, watching as Victor's shoulders slumped even further. But I can see that you're truly sorry and that you want to make things right. Victor looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Samuel continued his tone, steady but forgiving. I believe in second chances. Victor and I believe that forgiveness is a powerful tool for change. Tears welled up in Victor's eyes as Samuel's words sank in. You're forgiving me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel nodded slowly. Yes, I am. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means giving you the opportunity to do better, to be better. A small smile tugged at the corners of Samuel's lips as an idea formed in his mind. In fact, I think you're in a unique position to make a real difference, Victor. You've seen firsthand how biases can cloud judgment and lead to injustice. Why not use that experience to help change the culture within the police force? Victor's eyes widened as he considered Samuel's words. You really think I could do that? He asked, a glimmer of hope in his voice. Samuel leaned forward, his gaze intense. I do it. It won't be easy, and you'll have a lot to learn. But if you're willing to put in the work to face your own biases and help others do the same, you could make a real impact. Victor sat up straighter, a newfound determination in his posture. I want to do that, he said firmly. I want to make amends, not just to you and Chloe, but to everyone who's been hurt by prejudice in law enforcement. I know I have a lot to learn, but I'm ready to start. Samuel reached out and placed a hand on Victor's shoulder. A gesture of support and encouragement, that's the first step. Victor acknowledged that there's room for growth and was willing to do the hard work of changing in the weeks following the revelations. The consequences of Mrs. Annabelle's actions and the jewelry store's involvement began to unfold. The once bustling upscale store now stood empty, its windows covered with brown paper, and a closed sign hung on the door, a silent testament to the settlement that had forced its closure. Samuel walked past the shuttered store, feeling a mix of satisfaction and sadness. While justice had been served, he couldn't help but think of the innocent employees who had lost their jobs due to the actions of a few. He sighed, reminding himself that sometimes change came at a cost. Meanwhile, Mrs. Annabelle found herself embroiled in a series of legal battles. Her carefully crafted image of a respectable judge's wife had crumbled, revealing a web of deceit and fraud. The courtroom, once a place where she wielded influence through her husband, now became the stage for her own reckoning. As news of the case spread, it sparked a broader conversation about racial bias and insurance fraud. Insurance companies, faced with public scrutiny, began to re-evaluate their policies and procedures. They implemented new guidelines for handling claims, particularly those involving suspected theft and racial profiling. Law enforcement agencies too felt the ripple effects of the case. The incident with Chloe had exposed deep-rooted issues within the system, prompting a hard look at how officers handled such situations. Samuel, seeing an opportunity for meaningful change, threw himself into advocacy work. He spent long hours meeting with police officials, community leaders, and policymakers. His experiences as both an FBI agent and a father who had witnessed injustice firsthand lent weight to his words. Samuel spoke passionately about the need for change, sharing Chloe's story and the broader implications it held. "We have a responsibility," Samuel said during one particularly heated meeting, "to ensure that what happened to my daughter never happens to another child. We need to address the biases that exist within our system and work actively to overcome them." His tireless efforts began to bear fruit. The police department, under increasing pressure from the community and city officials, agreed to implement new policies. These included stricter guidelines for detaining suspects, especially minors, and a more thorough review process for complaints involving racial bias. Perhaps the most significant change came in the form of mandatory bias training for all officers. The program, developed with input from community leaders and experts in racial justice, aimed to help officers recognize and overcome their own biases. It wasn't a perfect solution, Samuel knew, but it was a start. As he watched the first group of officers file into the training room, Samuel felt a glimmer of hope among them. Was Victor looking nervous, but determined? Their eyes met, and Victor gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had both undertaken. The chief looked surprised but not entirely shocked. "Are you sure about this?" the chief asked, his brow furrowed. Victor nodded firmly. "Yes, sir. I believe it's the right thing to do. I need to make amends, and I can't do that wearing this badge after clearing out his locker and saying goodbye to his colleagues." Victor left the precinct for the last time. He felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. In the days that followed, Victor found himself drawn to a local youth outreach program. He had passed by their colorful storefront many times, but had never given it much thought. Now it seemed like a beacon of hope. With hesitation, he pushed open the door and was greeted by the warm smile of a volunteer coordinator named Sarah. "Hi there. Are you interested in volunteering?" she asked cheerfully. Victor nodded, feeling slightly out of place. "I think I am. I'm looking to make a difference." Sarah's smile widened. "Well, you've come to the right place. We always need help with our after-school programs." Victor felt a pang of guilt remembering his encounter with Chloe. He took a deep breath and decided to share his own story. "I used to be a police officer." He began noticing how some of the teens tensed up, and I made a terrible mistake. I accused an innocent girl of theft because of my own biases. It cost me my job, but more importantly, it taught me how wrong I was. The room fell silent, all eyes on Victor. He continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here because I want to learn from you to understand your experiences. I want to be better." To his surprise, Samuel Bennett stood near the podium, his FBI badge gleaming in the sunlight. He scanned the crowd, a proud smile spreading across his face as he spotted Chloe. His daughter was no longer the timid girl who had been wrongfully accused. Instead, she moved confidently among her peers, engaging in animated discussions about the new initiative. Chloe's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm as she explained to a group of younger kids. "This program is going to help us understand each other better. It's about trust and working together a few feet away." Victor Harrow stood nervously at the edge of the gathering. He fidgeted with the sleeve of his casual shirt, feeling out of place without his uniform. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, determined to be part of the change he now believed in. As the event officially began, Samuel took the stage. His voice rang out clear and strong. "Today marks a new beginning for our community. We are here to build understanding, to foster trust, and to create a safer environment for everyone." He gestured toward Chloe and several other young people who had been affected by similar incidents. These brave individuals have turned their experiences into a force for good. They've shown us that healing is possible, that forgiveness can lead to transformation. Chloe beamed with pride as she joined her father on the stage. She spoke with a confidence that touched everyone present. "What happened to me was scary and unfair, but it taught me that we all have the power to make a difference. By working together and understanding each other, we can create real change." As Chloe finished her speech, she noticed Victor in the crowd. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the memory of that fateful day at the jewelry store flickered between them. But instead of fear or anger, they offered a small, encouraging smile. Victor felt a lump form in his throat, overwhelmed by the grace Chloe had shown him despite his past mistakes. With trembling steps, he approached the stage as Samuel invited community members to share their thoughts, standing before the microphone. Victor's voice quivered with emotion. I used to be part of the problem. My biases and mistakes hurt innocent people like Chloe, but through her forgiveness and my own journey of learning, I've seen that change is possible. I'm committed to being part of the solution now." The crowd listened in respectful silence, many nodding in understanding as Victor stepped down. Samuel reached out and shook his hand, a gesture of reconciliation that spoke volumes. Victor's transformation was only beginning, but he felt a renewed purpose. His time volunteering at the youth center continued, and his presence became a comforting, familiar face to the teens who had initially viewed him with suspicion. He encouraged others to speak openly, and his own story became a lesson in humility and the power of personal growth. In the months that followed, the ripple effects of the jewelry store case reached far and wide. Miss Annabelle faced multiple criminal charges, while Judge Annabelle's reputation took a hit as investigations into his connections and decisions in previous cases intensified. Public scrutiny and media coverage called for stronger oversight of judicial actions and a greater focus on ethical accountability within the legal system. Meanwhile, Samuel continued his advocacy, collaborating with community leaders, local government officials, and law enforcement agencies. With his background in the FBI and his firsthand experience, Samuel became a prominent voice for systemic change. His work was pivotal in implementing reforms such as bias reduction training, stricter protocols for detaining minors, and enhanced accountability measures in cases of alleged racial profiling on the streets and in community centers. Samuel and Chloe's story sparked conversations that hadn't been openly discussed before. Community leaders, teachers, and families joined together to support each other and push for more inclusive policies. It became clear that change wasn't just about one case, it was about addressing long-standing issues that impacted countless lives. Victor found himself taking part in these discussions, helping police departments across the state implement new training programs that emphasized empathy, understanding, and fair treatment of all individuals. His transformation was an example for other officers to reflect on their own biases and experiences. Victor's presence became symbolic of the journey from ignorance to awareness, from prejudice to understanding. As these community efforts took hold, Samuel noticed a shift. Fewer incidents of unwarranted suspicion and unfair treatment occurred, and complaints involving racial bias were now met with greater scrutiny. The changes were slow and sometimes met with resistance, but progress was being made. A year after the incident, the community center held another gathering. This time, it was a celebration of the strides they'd made together. Samuel and Chloe stood at the center of it, their story a reminder of the power of resilience and the possibility of forgiveness. Standing side by side, they watched as the event unfolded, a new generation learning from the mistakes of the past. Victor, too, was there volunteering to help with logistics. He had become an integral part of the youth center, forming strong connections with the teens who once viewed him with suspicion. He was no longer seen as just a former officer. He was a mentor, a guide, and an ally. As the evening wound down, Samuel found Victor standing by the edge of the crowd, looking thoughtful. Samuel approached him, giving him a pat on the back. "You did good," Victor, Samuel said with a smile. "You've made a real difference." Victor nodded, a sense of pride and humility in his expression. "I couldn't have done it without you and Chloe. You both showed me that change is possible and that there's always room to grow." Samuel chuckled softly. "We all have room to grow, and the best part is we're in it together now." Chloe joined them, smiling brightly. "You both taught me so much about courage and forgiveness. I hope I can help others see the importance of that." As they stood together, the sun setting in the background, the weight of the past faded, leaving room for hope and a shared commitment to a better future. Samuel, Chloe, and Victor knew that the journey was far from over, but they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. With the community united in purpose and determination, they continued their work, paving the way for a brighter, more just world, one step at a time. Thank you for watching until the end of the story. If you found this video meaningful and thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. Please like and share to help spread this message to even more people. And feel free to leave a comment below to share your thoughts on the character's journey. We'd love to hear from you. The hospital hummed with the usual bustle of nurses, wheeling patients. Doctors consulted on rounds, the occasional announcement over the intercom, Dr. Malcolm Hayes, a renowned cardiac surgeon, had just wrapped up a grueling 7-hour operation that saved a young woman's life. Wiping sweat from his brow, he headed toward the break room for a much-needed cup of coffee. As he rounded the corner, he spotted a commotion near the hospital's front desk. 2 uniformed officers stood stiffly, one of them a tall, broad-shouldered Ed, a white man with a badge reading Officer Grayson, speaking tersely to the receptionist. His voice carried across the room. "Are you sure? Because we've got reports of someone matching the description causing trouble in this area." The receptionist, a young woman named Clara, was flustered but firm. "There's no one like that here, officer. This is a hospital, not a nightclub, officer." Grayson's eyes scanned the lobby, narrowing as they land on Dr. Hayes, tall and impeccably dressed in scrubs, and a white coat with his stethoscope still draped around his neck. Dr. Hayes hardly fit the image of a troublemaker, yet Grayson's gaze lingered, his expression hardening. He nudged his partner and gestured subtly in Malcolm's direction. The tension was palpable. Malcolm sensed the unspoken challenge, but kept his cool, sipping his coffee as he watched the officer approach. "Excuse me," Grayson said in his cold and clipped tone. "Can I see some ID?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "ID? I'm Dr. Hayes. I work here. Is there a problem?" Grayson crossed his arms. "We've got reports of a suspicious individual loitering around here. You match the description. Just show me some ID, and we'll clear this up." Curiosity bubbled among the hospital staff who had begun to gather at the edges of the lobby. Clara exchanged a worried glance with Malcolm, but he gave her a small nod, signaling her to stay calm. The tension crackled like static electricity. Malcolm reached into his pocket, pulling out his hospital badge and holding it out deliberately. "Here you go. Dr. Malcolm Hayes, Chief of Cardiac Surgery. Is this suspicious enough for you?" Grayson barely glanced at the badge before sneering. "How do I know this isn't fake? Let's step outside and sort this out." Malcolm chuckled softly, his deep, resonant voice carrying through the room. "Step outside, officer. This is my workplace. If there's sorting to be done, we can do it right here. Unless, of course, you're suggesting that I abandon my patients." Grayson's jaw tightened, his hand resting ominously on the holster at his hip. The air grew heavier with the unspoken implication. Malcolm's heart pounded, but his expression remained serene, a quiet strength radiating from him as he waited for Grayson's next move. The lobby seemed to hold its breath. Every pair of eyes was trained on the unfolding confrontation. Dr. Malcolm Hayes stood tall and unshaken, his presence commanding even as the tension around him swelled. Officer Grayson, however, leaned into his role with unsettling intensity. His partner, a younger officer named Martinez, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "Step outside, Dr. Hayes," Grayson repeated, his voice louder and more insistent. "I won't ask again." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, studying the officer with an unreadable expression. His calm, poised demeanor only seemed to inflame Grayson further. Finally, Malcolm spoke, his tone measured but resolute. "Officer, let me get this straight. You want me, a surgeon who just finished saving a life, to leave the hospital, my place of work, because I match a description you haven't shared, by the way." Grayson's mouth twitched in irritation. "We have a report of a black male acting suspiciously in the area. You match the height, build, and skin color." Malcolm interrupted smoothly, raising an eyebrow. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a pointed challenge. "Let me guess. The report didn't mention scrubs, a lab coat, or a stethoscope. Did it mention a scalpel in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other?" A few stifled chuckles rippled through the small crowd of hospital staff, breaking the oppressive silence. Grayson's face flushed, and he stepped closer, his posture bristling with barely contained anger. "Don't play games with me," he snarled. "This is official business. If you don't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to take you in." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. He sat down his coffee cup on the counter with deliberate care and crossed his arms. "Take me in for what exactly? Drinking coffee, performing life-saving surgeries, or existing in this hospital while black?" Martina shifted uncomfortably again, clearing his throat as if he wanted to intervene, but Grayson cut him off with a sharp glance. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The audience was growing now. Nurses, interns, and even a couple of patients were watching with a mixture of concern and indignation. Clara, the receptionist, was furiously typing something on her computer, her face set in determination. "You're making it harder," Officer Malcolm said, his voice as steady as ever. "You walked into this hospital looking for trouble. Well, congratulations, you found it. The question is, what are you going to do about it now that you've realized you're wrong?" Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but Malcolm held up a hand to stop him. "Before you answer, let me offer a word of caution. Every moment you stand here, harassing me, is a moment you're putting the lives of my patients at risk. Think carefully about your next move. Officer, are you prepared to explain this to my staff, my patients, and your superiors?" The subtle but undeniable power in Malcolm's words hung heavy in the air. Grayson's expression faltered for a split second, but his pride and prejudice reference refused to let him back down. The silence that followed was electric. "Officer." Grayson's jaw tightened, his hand flexing over his holstered weapon as if it were a lifeline. But Malcolm didn't flinch. If anything, his unwavering calm only highlighted the officer's increasing aggression. "You're not in charge here," Dr. Grayson barked, his voice echoing in the cavernous lobby. "This isn't your operating room now. Are you going to cooperate? Or am I going to have to take you in for obstruction from behind the desk?" Clara stood abruptly, her voice breaking the tension. "Officer, Dr. Hayes is one of the most respected surgeons in this hospital. Everyone here knows him. If you're accusing him of something, you'd better have more than a vague description to go on." Grayson shot her a glare that could have melted glass, but Clara didn't waver. Her bravery seemed to ignite something in the crowd of hospital staff. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group, and a few nurses nodded emphatically. Malcolm seized the moment. "Officer, it seems you're in a room full of witness-wise. Who can vouch for me now, unless you're prepared to escalate this into a full-blown public incident? I suggest you reconsider your approach." Grayson's partner, Martinez, finally stepped forward. "Maybe we should take a second to not now," Grayson snapped, cutting him off. He turned his attention back to Malcolm, but the surgeon's confidence and the growing solidarity of the crowd were clearly unnerving him. Suddenly, a low voice came from behind the officers. "What's going on here?" All heads turned as Dr. Elizabeth Crane, the hospital's chief administrator, entered the lobby. Her sharp suit and piercing gaze commanded immediate respect. Her reputation as a no-nonsense leader was well known, and she looked every bit the part now as her eyes darted between Grayson and Malcolm. "Dr. Hayes," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Is everything all right?" Malcolm gestured to Grayson. "It seems, officer, Grayson here has some concerns about my presence in the hospital. Doctor." Crane's expression darkened as she turned to the office officer. "Grayson, this is Dr. Malcolm Hayes, our chief cardiac surgeon. He's been with this hospital for over 10 years, and his record speaks for itself. Now please explain why you feel the need to question one of my staff members in such an aggressive manner." Grayson's confidence faltered, but he quickly rallied. "We received a report of a suspicious individual, and he matched the description of what exactly Dr. Crane interrupted her voice, sharp, a surgeon saving lives, because that's the only description that fits. Dr. Hayes Martinez looked as though he wanted to melt into the floor, but Grayson held his ground. "I was just doing my job, ma'am." Dr. Crane's lips thinned. "And I'm doing mine. This hospital is a place of healing and respect. Your behavior is neither professional nor appropriate, and I will not have my staff subjected to baseless harassment." Grayson bristled. His pride was clearly stung. "Ma'am, I don't take orders from you." Malcolm, who had been silent during this exchange, stepped forward. "No, officer, but you do take orders from your department. I imagine they'll be very interested in hearing how you disrupted a hospital for no legitimate reason at that moment." Clara cleared her throat and held up her phone. "By the way, this entire interaction has been recorded. I've already sent it to our hospital's legal team." Grayson's face drained of color for the first time. The balance of power had shifted entirely out of his control. Grayson's face shifted through a spectrum of emotions: anger, disbelief, and something uncomfortably close to fear. His partner, Officer Martinez, seemed torn between loyalty to his superior and the glaring reality of the situation. The crowd in the lobby watched intently, their quiet presence amplifying the weight of the moment. "Let me see that," Grayson snapped, reaching for Clara's phone. Clara pulled it back sharply, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Not a chance. This recording belongs to me, and I've already sent a copy to our legal department. You can explain your actions to them if you'd like." Dr. Malcolm Hayes watched the exchange with a calm exterior, but inside he was carefully considering his next move. He could see Grayson's ego teetering on the edge of collapse. but the officer wasn't ready to admit defeat, at least not yet. Grayson turned back to Malcolm, his jaw tight. "You think you're clever, don't you? But a phone recording doesn't tell the whole story. I was responding to a legitimate call, and I have the right to investigate any situation I deem suspicious." Mal's voice was a soft challenge, his words slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "I'd love to hear what exactly you found suspicious about me. Was it the scrubs? The badge? Or was it simply the fact that I don't look like you?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Grayson's hand moved instinctively to his belt, his fingers brushing the radio as if he were considering calling for backup. But before he could act, Dr. Elizabeth Crane stepped forward, her commanding presence filling the room. "Officer Grayson," she said, her voice icy with authority, "let me remind you that you are in a hospital, a place where people come to receive care, not to be harassed. Dr. Hayes is not only an exemplary surgeon, but also a respected leader in this community. If you have any evidence to support your so-called investigation, present it now. Otherwise, I strongly suggest you leave before you dig yourself into an even deeper hole." Grayson's eyes darted to his partner, but Martinez was no longer making any effort to mask his discomfort. "She's right," Martinez said quietly. "We don't have anything to go on. Maybe we should just be quiet," Grayson barked, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The cracks in his armor were widening, and the pressure of the growing crowd was becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Malcolm stepped to the center of the lobby, his every movement deliberate and controlled. He raised his voice, addressing both the officers and the gathered staff. "This isn't just about me. What's happening here is a reflection of a larger problem, one that too many people in this country face every day. Prejudice like this doesn't just harm individuals. It erodes trust in the very institutions meant to protect and serve." The staff nodded their quiet support, emboldening him. Malcolm turned his attention back to Grayson, his gaze piercing. "You came here expecting to find a criminal, but instead you found a community standing together. So, officer Grayson, the question is, what kind of man are you going to be when you walk out of this building? Will you admit your mistake, or will you let your pride drag you down further?" Grayson's face burned with humiliation, but he said nothing. For the first time, it seemed as though the weight of his actions was beginning to sink in. Martinez stepped closer to him, his voice low but firm. "Let him go, Grayson. This isn't worth it." Grayson hesitated, his hand still hovering near his radio. The crowd watched, waiting to see if he would relent or escalate. The room seemed frozen in time as Officer Grayson stood at a crossroads. His pride and his authority hung in delicate balance against the sheer weight of reason, evidence, and the resolute crowd that had formed against him. Every eye was on him, every face silently demanding that he make his next move carefully. "You came here expecting to intimidate someone who had done nothing wrong, and when confronted with the truth, you refused to listen. Now the entire hospital is watching. What happens next is entirely up to you." Grayson's eyes flicked nervously to Clara, who still held her phone up. The recording feature was unmistakable. "You don't have the whole story," he muttered defensively. "I was doing my job." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass and profile. And just so we are clear, you failed on both counts today." At that moment, Dr. Elizabeth Crane stepped forward, her authoritative presence slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "Officer Grayson," she said firmly, "this hospital will not tolerate any behavior that jeopardizes the safety and well-being of our staff or patients. If you don't leave immediately, I will personally ensure that this incident is reported to your superiors, complete with evidence from our security cameras and the statements of every witness here." The mention of security cameras sent a visible ripple of unease through Grayson. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the small black domes mounted on the ceiling, their blinking red lights silently confirming Dr. Crane's words. His brow creased further, his posture sagging slightly under the weight of his own folly. Before Grayson could respond, Martinez took a decisive step forward. "Check," he said, his voice louder and more resolute than before. "We're done here." He turned to Malcolm and nodded. "Dr. Hayes, I'm sorry for the misunderstanding." The sincerity in Martinez's voice surprised Malcolm, but he gave a small nod in return. "Acknowledging the mistake is a good first step," Malcolm replied, his tone measured. "I hope it won't be the last." Grayson opened his mouth to argue, but Martinez shot him a pointed look that silenced him. "Let us go," Martinez said, His voice is firm now. Grayson hesitated, his gaze flicking between Malcolm, the crowd, and his partner. Finally, with a barely contained sneer, he turned on his heel and stalked toward the exit. Martinez followed, offering another apologetic glance to the assembled staff before disappearing through the sliding glass doors. As the doors closed behind them, the tension in the room broke like a snapped wire. A collective exhale swept through the crowd, followed by scattered applause. Clara set her phone down her shoulders, relaxing for the first time since the encounter began, as the sliding doors closed behind the officers. Dr. Malcolm Hayes turned back to the gathered crowd. The tension had evaporated, but an unmistakable energy of solidarity and resolve remained. Malcolm, ever the calm presence, raised a hand to quiet the murmurs. "Thank you," he said, his voice clear and resonant, "not just for standing with me, but for standing against something much bigger than this moment." Clara, still visibly shaken, spoke up. "I'm so sorry, Dr. Hayes. I should have called for help sooner." Malcolm gave her a reassuring smile. "You did exactly what you should have. Clara, you stood your ground, and you showed courage. That's what matters. Doctor." Elizabeth Crane stepped forward, her sharp gaze sweeping across the staff. This incident wasn't just about Dr. Hayes. It was about all of us, about how we respond to injustice when it shows up at our doorstep. Today we proved that this hospital is a place where we look out for one another. The staff nodded in agreement, but Malcolm wasn't finished. "What happened here is part of a larger problem," he said, his tone thoughtful but firm. "This wasn't the first time I've been profiled, and it likely won't be the last, but each time we have a choice. Do we let it pass, or do we use it as an opportunity to demand better?" Clara, emboldened by his words, raised her hand slightly. "What can we do? I mean, beyond what we just did?" Malcolm looked at her, his expression one of quiet determination. "We start by documenting everything: this recording, the security footage, and witness statements. We send it to the police department and the media if necessary. We hold people accountable, not just to punish, but to educate." Dr. Crane nodded. "I'll be speaking to the hospital's legal team and drafting a formal complaint to the department, but we should also look inward. Let's use this as an opportunity to reinforce our own commitment to equity and inclusion through training policy reviews and making sure every staff member feels safe and respected." The staff murmured in agreement. A renewed sense of purpose settled over the group. One of the nurses, a young woman named Rachel, stepped forward hesitantly. "Dr. Hayes, I just want to say what you did was incredible. The way you stayed calm even when he was so aggressive. I don't think I could have done that." Malcolm smiled warmly. "It wasn't easy, Rachel, but I've learned that anger, while justified, doesn't always get the results we need. Sometimes the most powerful response is to remain composed and let the truth speak for itself." As the staff began to disperse, Malcolm turned to Dr. Crane. "Thank you for stepping in when you did. That could have gone a very different way." Dr. Crane placed a hand on his shoulder. "You handled yourself brilliantly. Malcolm, the first proud to have you on this team." Just as Malcolm was about to head back to his office, Clara approached him with her phone. "Dr. Hayes, there's something else. I think you should see." She played the video she had recorded in it. Grayson's every action, his hostility, his baseless accusations, and his reluctance to leave were laid bare. Clara had also captured Malcolm's poised responses, and the moment when Martinez intervened to de-escalate was a clear and damning record of the events. "We should share this," Clara said. "The world needs to see what happened here." Malcolm hesitated. He knew the video could spark a broader conversation, but it could also bring backlash and unwanted attention. After a moment of thought, he nodded. "Share it with the hospital's legal team first. If they give the green light, we'll decide how to release it." The video from Clara's phone made its way through the proper channels, first to the hospital's legal team, then to the local police department, and finally to the public. Within days, it was the subject of widespread discussion on social media and local news. The footage was undeniable, capturing every moment of Officer Grayson's hostility and baseless accusations, as well as Dr. Malcolm Hayes' dignified and composed response. The public's reaction was swift and overwhelming. Community leaders called for an investigation into Grayson's conduct, while activists rallied around the hospital, praising its staff for standing up against injustice. Within a week, the police department announced that Grayson had been placed on administrative leave pending a full inquiry for Malcolm. The aftermath of the incident brought both challenges and opportunities. His face became synonymous with resilience and grace in the face of prejudice, drawing attention far beyond the hospital's walls. Invitations for interviews poured in from national news outlets, and Malcolm found himself thrust into a role he hadn't sought, that of a spokesperson for change. At first, Malcolm hesitated. He had always been dedicated to his patients, not the spotlight. But the more he thought about the incident, the more he realized the power of his platform. If sharing his story could help prevent others from facing similar treatment, then perhaps it was worth stepping out of his comfort zone. In a live interview with a prominent news network, Malcolm spoke candidly about the experience. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident," he said. "It's part of a systemic issue that requires all of us to confront our biases and hold ourselves accountable. This isn't just about one officer or one hospital. It's about creating a society where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, no matter their race or profession." Meanwhile, within the hospital, the incident spurred meaningful change. Under Dr. Elizabeth Crane's leadership, the hospital implemented new training programs focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Staff members were encouraged to share their experiences and ideas for fostering a more inclusive environment, and the hospital's commitment to these values became a model for others in the community. As for Officer Grayson, the investigation into his conduct concluded with consequences that were both swift and impactful. He was suspended without pay and ordered to complete an extensive program on bias and escalation techniques, while some in the community demanded harsher penalties. Malcolm advocated for education and reform over retribution. "I don't believe in tearing people down," Malcolm said in a follow-up interview. "I believe in building a better future, one where people like Officer Grayson can learn from their mistakes and become part of the solution." In the months that followed, the hospital became a beacon of hope and progress for patients. Staff and community members alike drew inspiration from the incident and its aftermath, seeing it as a reminder that change was possible when people stood together for Malcolm. Life gradually returned to its normal rhythm of surgeries, consultations, and late-night coffee runs, but he carried the experience with him, using it as a reminder of his own strength and the strength of those who had stood by him. One day, as he passed through the lobby where the confrontation had unfolded, he paused for a moment. The space was bustling as always, filled with the sounds of healing and hope. Malcolm smiled, knowing that in some small way, the hospital and the world were better for what had happened.